Analog horror is kind of a dirty word nowadays. What was once a rather sparse genre of horror that you had to look pretty hard to find has become a widespread phenomenon to the point that people are kind of sick of it now. Which, like, you know, that happens. Pretty much anything that is popular at one time eventually falls victim to the Twitter, actually it was never good crowd, and vice versa. But anyway, I'm not really here to talk about how there are definitely some less than sincere attempts to create genuine, effective analog horror projects nowadays. Instead, I wanted to talk about why these projects garnered the sort of following they did, and nailed out exactly what it is that makes them so unsettling. I mean, we've had horror stories being told for around 200 years in some form, and the film market is packed with horror movies, but none of them have ever really reached the same level of infamy and oversaturation that analog horror has. What made analog horror so good that eventually it was considered bad?
Mr. Van W. King seems the secret pyro.
So, we really can't talk about analog horror without talking about mascot horror. Whilst they're not intrinsically linked, the two genres do often find themselves being part of the same projects, and honestly, when you look at the two ideas on paper, it makes perfect sense. The super baseline vague underlying definition of analog horror is basically just horror that takes the form of found footage and has like a VHS appearance. They're usually set during the early 2000s for that reason, but camcorders are much older than that, so they do also go back as far as the 80s sometimes. So obviously when you're using technology of this era to tell your story, it's going to evoke a lot of nostalgia, right? Especially for the audience watching these things, namely people who were kids in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it just so happens that something else kids of that time period probably have a lot of memories with are mascots. Like, yeah, before we had sports mascots, sure, but I mean TV mascots like Elmo and Bugs Bunny, video game mascots like Mario and Banjo-Kazooie, restaurant mascots like Chuck E. Cheese, and you know where I'm going with this. I know, but we gotta talk about online horror trends without mentioning Mr. Freddy Fazbear himself, can we? The Faz Man was instrumental in popularizing mascot horror, the baseline definition of that being horror that revolves around a mascot, usually acting as your monster, that is both a mascot in the context of the story and is just child-friendly enough that you can pump out merch aimed at all the kiddywinks to make mad dollar, as us gangsters say. I won't spend too long here because you don't need me to tell you this, but Five Nights at Freddy's obviously played on the uncanny nature of mascot costumes found in Chuck E. Cheese specifically, but also like Disneyland parks and other places. I was one of those kids who was terrified of these things. I actually very vividly remember having to be taken out of a Postman Pat meet and greet at the age of 3 or 4 because this hulking grey mass of plastic came walking towards me, and that's exactly why Five Nights at Freddy's worked. Our child brains have a way of skewing memories and perspective to make things that aren't scary absolutely terrifying, and that's exactly the philosophy behind Five Nights at Freddy's as a concept. And honestly, I think FNaF and Mascot Horror is a big factor in what got analog horror off the ground. I mean, the first instance of really popular analog horror was Local 58. If you're not aware, Local 58 was a series of horror shorts that then later tried to become some kind of linked narrative, but they popped up not long after Mr. Fazbear, and from there on out, these two concepts became forever linked. I mean, there's even elements of analog horror in FNaF. You're looking through old monitors, and most things are still images. There's lots of extended silence. It's not all that far removed to begin with. And then the flood started. Poppy Playtime, Catastrophe Crow, Amanda the Adventurer, The Walton Files, Welcome Home, Angel Hair, the Mario 64 Beta Project, or the Internal Plexus if you'd rather, the FNaF tapes, and most recently Shipwreck 64. There are so many analog horror projects that utilize both of these things, and that's not a coincidence. It's the nostalgia. Nostalgia is a really powerful emotion, and ultimately that's what's at play here. Nostalgia can be something that brings you great joy or even great sadness, but it can also cause discomfort. Seeing something so familiar in a twisted context unsettles the brain in a way that's not even immediately obvious as to why. I spoke about this in one of our previous videos as well, but having this visceral feeling that something is wrong with something that once felt safe is incredibly powerful, and I think that's one reason that analog horror reached the heights it did. Childhoods are fairly universal, and in most cases, the people watching this content are going to feel some sense of twisted nostalgia from it. And what makes nostalgia so powerful? It's real. It's part of our lives, which brings me on to another reason analog horror blew up the way it did, and that's the rise of the ARG. ARGs, or alternate reality games, are something I'm sure most people watching this video are familiar with, but just in case you're not, it refers to an interactive story that sort of transcends the fourth wall and inserts itself into real life. For example, The Sun Is Gone was a Twitter account that told its story through tweets from a supposed real person. Gemini Home Entertainment uploaded supposedly real park safety videos under a real production company. Obviously they weren't real, it was all fake, but the idea is to pretend that they're not and present them as such. This also means that they have some level of audience interactability, and that's where the game part comes in. Analog horror has been significantly lifted up by the audience's ability to interact with it. See, most of the audience participation in these things takes the form of lore and plot that is told in a super vague and non-linear fashion, hidden behind extra unlisted videos, links to fake in-universe websites, and codes and ciphers. The audience then have to figure out what the hell is going on, and this is really clever for getting your project noticed for a couple of reasons. Humans as a species are inquisitive by nature, and when we don't understand something, we really like to try and figure it out. Our interest varies, of course, but if you're even slightly taken in by one of these things, chances are you'll want to understand it, and if you can't figure it out yourself, you'll go to others for help. Secondly, humans also really like to brag about stuff. We love letting others know when we achieve something, and if we think we've solved a somewhat difficult puzzle, or even if we know there's a puzzle that a lot of other people can't and we can solve, we want people to know about it. So hey, we're going to post about it, we're going to let them know. Well, it's because of your insatiable quest for knowledge that you've now acted as an advertisement for the project, and people who didn't know about it before now do. This goes on and on and on until some big horror YouTuber covers the project once enough has been uncovered, and boom, the project's blown up. And analog horror works so well in tandem with ARGs because they both rely on being uncanny, on being something that feels so close to real life, and because they can both be done on extremely low budgets. It does not cost that much to make a YouTube channel, overlay a VHS effect on some distorted images, and create some vague lore for an audience to figure out. If you've got the idea, you can kind of just put it in practice. But there is something even scarier about real life, something that the nostalgia of a familiar safe space being twisted into a creepy context and audience interactability both feed into, something they both offer, something that analog horror's chosen medium, the world of self-published YouTube videos and itch.io indie games, allows that no other genre does: unpredictability.
Don't mind if I do!
The world is chaos and anarchy, and anything could happen at any given time. Media creates this shield around its content. There's an expectation when you watch a Disney film that the violence is never going to be too graphic, the language is going to be PG-13 or worse, and the good guys are usually going to walk away with a win. Similarly, when you go into a horror film, you have expectations. You know there will be blood, jump scares, unsettling imagery, and you can usually tell by both the age rating and the platform it's on just how bad it's going to be. Even if you're a full R-rated screening, there's a limit to what you can show. If you're watching something at the theatre, you will know it's been toned for a mainstream 18+ audience. Analog horror doesn't have that boundary. It is untethered and can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants.
Apparently I can't talk to him. Oh my god! Oh! Oh! Jeez! Oh my gosh!
Traditional horror films have a lot of cadence to them. There's a build before a jump scare. There's a clear plot from A to B, your monster or killer doing bad guy things, and your victim or hero surviving against them. They have to meet run times, they have to sell tickets and meet production criterias. Analog horror doesn't have any of this. It can release a story in a weird number of parts, like 16 if it wants, and all those parts can be anywhere from 37 seconds to 58 minutes long, and nobody can stop them. And the games in the genre are exactly the same. They can be a cutesy cartoon beaver running around helping his friends, you know, the most innocent stuff you've ever seen, and then suddenly you could be watching someone get his head caved in by a creepy ass killer in a costume, and none of this has to be disclosed to you. And as you sit and interact with these projects, you realize that you really have no way of knowing just how far they'll go. And that is what is so terrifying about analog horror, that ironically, despite the cookie cutter trends of their own that the creators fall into, these projects are truly untethered. There is nothing that stops an E for everyone cartoon mascot platformer from devolving all the way into full-on body horror, nudity, gore, and all the other extremely dark themes that YouTube won't let me talk about. That is terrifying, and that is the true crux of why this genre has done so well, in my opinion. It may be oversaturated, and there may be a ton of creators all throwing their hat into the ring trying to be the next big trend, but isn't that sort of a good thing? I mean, at the end of the day, it's oversaturated for a reason. This content clearly spoke to people. It clearly left enough of an impact that certain viewers said, hey, I want to make something like that too. And perhaps coolest of all is because of the way the genre is structured, they were able to. From their offices, their bedrooms, even their phones. I see a lot of audiences now thinking it's cool to dunk on people for making analog and mascot horror projects, and look, sure, if they're asking for your money, then by all means dunk away, but if someone out there falls in love with a piece of content so much that it inspires them enough to take their own stab at it and put it out into the world for all to see, then I think that's awesome and should only be celebrated. Independent artists are the ones who bring innovation and new ideas to the scene. Scott Cawthon was a failed game developer with a ton of ideas nobody liked until he created FNaF and changed horror forever. So the next time you think it might be a good idea to step on someone's creativity because it's a little rough around the edges or something you think is cringe and overdone, maybe just take another second and consider holding your tongue. Because you never know what that person might make next.